On the morning of April 7, 1945, dawn broke over Tokyo Bay with the calm indifference of nature, even as one of the most audacious missions of the Second World War unfolded above it. One North American P-51 D Mustangs from the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups streaked toward the rendezvous point that would take them deep into the Japanese homeland, something military planners had once considered impossible for a single-engine fighter. In the cockpit of one Mustang, Major James B. Tapp gripped his control stick, his six-wing, mounted 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns loaded with armor, piercing incendiary ammunition. Below him, the tranquil cone of Mount Fuji rose from the mist, its snow-capped peak serving as both a navigation beacon and a symbol of the empire these American pilots were about to defy. As the first rays of sunlight touched the patchwork of rice fields and villages beneath, Japanese farmers looked up at aircraft they had never before seen, sleek, silver-bodied machines cutting contrails across a sky that had once belonged entirely to them. The operation was unprecedented in its ambition. From their new forward base on Iwo Jima, 750 miles from Japan, the Mustangs were to escort B-29 Superfortress bombers over Tokyo, protecting them from Japanese interceptors that had previously torn through unescorted bomber formations. Only 2 years earlier, experts in both the Army Air Forces and the Navy had insisted that such long-range fighter escorts were beyond the realm of possibility. Yet as the morning haze lifted, more than 100 Japanese aircraft scrambled to intercept an enemy no one had imagined could reach the capital. The sight that met them, single-engine American fighters soaring over their own homeland, shattered a core assumption of Japanese air defense. For months they had been told that American fighters lacked the range to reach the home islands. Only carrier-borne planes, limited in endurance, could threaten Japan directly. But the P-51Ds, now flying confidently above Tokyo, were not carrier aircraft. They were land-based army fighters that had somehow crossed 3/4 miles of open ocean and arrived with fuel to spare. The psychological shock was immense. Veterans who had survived years of brutal aerial combat in China, Burma, and the Pacific suddenly realized the defensive perimeter of their empire had evaporated. Japan's most advanced interceptors, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, known to the Allies as the Franks, scrambled alongside older Ki-43 Hayabusas, Ki-44 Shokis, Ki-61 Heen fighters, and the Navy's A-6M0s and N-1K2 J Shidens. On paper, some of these aircraft could match or even climb the P-51 under certain conditions, but the reality unfolding that morning revealed the vast technological gulf between the two nations. The Mustangs swept into formation with a precision born of industrial discipline and rigorous training, their Merlin engines purring smoothly at cruising altitude, while Japanese pilots struggled with mechanical unreliability, fuel shortages, and faltering morale. For the Americans, the mission was both a technical triumph and a moral turning point. It demonstrated that the Pacific Ocean, once considered an insurmountable barrier, was now merely a wide runway. The P-51D Mustang, already legendary for its role in defeating the Luftwaffe over Europe, was proving that the same machine could reach Tokyo as easily as Berlin. When the Japanese fighters appeared, Major Tapp led his section into combat with clinical efficiency. They came at us in the traditional three-plane Shoto formation, he later reported, but their coordination was poor. We dove through them with 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, fired short bursts and climbed before they could react. The resulting engagements were brief, violent, and one-sided. Flight Sergeant Totanamizu of the 56th Cent, I later described his disbelief. When I saw the Mustangs with my own eyes, I thought I was dreaming. Our commanders had assured us no American fighter could reach Japan, yet there they were, flying as if they owned our sky. In that moment, I knew war was truly lost. His words capture more than personal despair. They mark the collapse of an entire strategic worldview. For the first time, Japanese airmen faced an enemy who could appear over the Emperor's palace and vanish again beyond the horizon. When the surviving Mustangs returned to Iwo Jima that evening, the 7th Fighter Command claimed 26 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of only 2 P-51s. The 13-to-1 kill ratio was staggering, and it would only grow in subsequent missions. But numbers tell only part of the story. The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo represented a symbolic conquest as profound as any territorial gain. It announced to both sides that Japan's isolation had ended and that American industrial and technological power could reach anywhere on the North American P-51 Mustang was not merely another fighter aircraft. It was the embodiment of modern industrial warfare, the physical expression of how engineering brilliance, industrial power, and international collaboration could merge into a single war-winning machine. By the time it arrived in the Pacific Theater, the Mustang had already earned a legendary reputation in Europe for breaking the Luftwaffe's back and making daylight bombing over Germany viable. Yet the aircraft's origins were surprisingly humble. Born from a British request in 1940 for a new fighter, the Mustang began as a design intended for export. Its transformation from an ordinary Allison engine prototype into the Merlin-powered P-51D that roared over Tokyo represented one of aviation's most successful transatlantic collaborations. It was a union of American aerodynamic innovation with British engine technology, a marriage that would change the balance of power in the skies. At the heart of the P-51D lay the Packard V1650-7, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66 engine. This supercharged 27-liter V12 produced 695 horsepower at takeoff and could reach 720 horsepower in emergency war power settings. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger was the key to its high-altitude performance, allowing the Mustang to maintain sea-level power at altitudes where Japanese radial engines gasped for air. The Merlin's intercooler system compressed and cooled the intake air, feeding the cylinders with dense oxygen, rich mixtures even above 25,000 feet. The result was a machine that could fly higher, faster, and farther than any single-engine fighter before it. At 25,000 feet, the P-51D could reach speeds of 440 miles per hour and climb to an operational ceiling of nearly 42,000 feet, figures that stunned opponents accustomed to slower, lower-flying aircraft. The Mustang's aerodynamic design was equally revolutionary. Its signature feature, the laminar flow wing, was a product of advanced research by North American aviation's engineer Edgar Schmude. Unlike conventional airfoils, which produced early boundary layer turbulence, the laminar flow design maintained smooth airflow across a larger portion of the wing's surface. This reduced drag by roughly 35%, dramatically improving range and fuel efficiency. Combined with its sleek fuselage, the Mustang possessed an elegance of form that was both beautiful and deadly, its performance as precise as its appearance was graceful. Every curve, every rivet served purpose. The long nose housed the Merlin engine like a rapier sheathed in steel, while the bubble canopy of later models granted pilots near-perfect visibility, an invaluable advantage in combat. Yet the true genius of the P-51 was not only in how fast or high it could fly, but how far. The aircraft's long-range capability transformed the entire nature of air warfare. Fitted with dual 110-gallon drop tanks, it could escort bombers on 500-mile round trips, sometimes even pushing to 600 when fuel management was precise. For perspective, that was the equivalent of flying from Los Angeles to Little Rock, Arkansas, entirely over water in a single-engine plane with no alternate landing sites. Its exceptional fuel economy, only 65 gallons per hour at economical cruise, was a direct result of the Merlin's efficiency and the aircraft's aerodynamic refinement. This made it the perfect escort for the massive B-29 raids against Japan, an achievement thought impossible just a year earlier. The Mustang's firepower matched its range and speed, 6-wing, mounted 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each firing 800 rounds per minute, could unleash nearly 80 rounds every second. Each armor-piercing incendiary bullet, traveling at 900 feet per second, carried enough kinetic energy to rip through aircraft armor, ignite fuel tanks, and destroy engines with surgical precision. In total, early model P-51DS carried 880 rounds, 500 for each inner gun and 270 for the center and outboard weapons. Later production variants standardized at 880 rounds, slightly reducing ammunition to improve reliability. The mathematical balance between ammunition weight, fuel load, and range was carefully optimized. Every ounce mattered, and American engineers calculated it with scientific precision. What made the Mustang truly formidable, however, was the system that produced it. North American Aviation's factories in California and Texas operated around the clock, turning out aircraft at a rate that defied imagination. At peak production, one new Mustang rolled off the assembly line every hour. By the end of the war, 586 Mustangs had been built, over 80 of them the D model alone. That single production run exceeded Japan's total output of all fighter types in the last 2 years of the conflict. Behind each P-51 stood the collective industrial might of an entire nation. Assembly lines running 24 hours a day, supported by thousands of subcontractors, precision machinists, and engineers. The Mustang was not just a plane, it was a symbol of America's ability to turn design into dominance through mass production. This production power translated into standardization and reliability. Every Mustang that rolled off the line was nearly identical to the last, with interchangeable parts and predictable performance. Pilots could step from one aircraft to another and feel no difference in control, response, or behavior. Maintenance crews could swap engines, replace panels, or change gun mounts in hours rather than days. The aircraft was designed for field serviceability, panels opened easily, major components were accessible, and ground crews trained to perfection in standardized procedures. This allowed operational readiness, rates above 80%, even in primitive conditions on volcanic islands like Iwo Jima. In contrast, Japanese aircraft, built with variable materials and little standardization, suffered chronic reliability problems and could barely sustain 40% readiness. The P-51 Mustang's combination of range, speed, and reliability made it a masterpiece of balanced engineering, a plane that turned theoretical superiority into operational supremacy. When it appeared over Tokyo, it represented far more than just an aircraft crossing an ocean. It was the arrival of a new era of air power, one defined not by proximity or courage alone, but by technology, precision, and the vast machinery of modern industry. The Mustang's hum over Mount Fuji was the sound of science overtaking spirit and of a nation's factories winning a war one rivet at a time. RTH. The P-51, silver wings glittering above Mount Fuji, heralded not just a new phase of the Pacific War, but the twilight of the Japanese Empire itself. While the P-51 Mustang represented the pinnacle of American industrial and technological achievement, Japan's answer to it, the Nakajima Kai-84 Hayate Gale, embodied a desperate attempt to bridge an ever-widening gap. Introduced in mid-1944, the Kai-84 was arguably Japan's finest fighter to see service in substantial numbers. Fast, agile, and heavily armed, it was a formidable design on paper, one that could theoretically match the Mustang in combat. Yet, like so much of Japan's late war weaponry, its promise was undermined by the realities of a nation on the brink of industrial collapse. The Hayate story is not merely that of a machine, but of an empire running out of time, materials, and trained men to wield its weapons effectively. The Kai-84 was designed to address the limitations of earlier Japanese fighters like the Kai-43 Hayabusa and the Kai-61 Hine. Those aircraft, though highly maneuverable, lacked armor protection, firepower, and the high-altitude performance needed to counter the increasingly powerful Allied aircraft appearing in Pacific skies. The Hayate sought to combine maneuverability with modern performance and heavy armament. Powered by the Nakajima Ha-45 Homer 18-cylinder radial engine, it produced around 2.0 horsepower at takeoff with the help of water, methanol injection, and a single-stage 2-speed supercharger. In prototype form, the aircraft could reach speeds approaching 427 miles per hour, comparable to early Mustangs, and boasted a climb rate that impressed test pilots. Its armament of two 20mm Ho 5 cannons and two 30mm Ho 155 cannons gave it a devastating punch. On paper, it was the equal of the P-51 and superior to any previous Japanese fighter. But paper victories meant little in the harsh conditions of 1945 Japan. The Hayate's impressive statistics were increasingly meaningless in an industrial system that could no longer produce quality aircraft. Chronic shortages of high-grade steel, aluminum, and precision tools turned the production line into a factory of compromise. Under relentless B-29 bombardment, Nakajima's facilities struggled to maintain even minimal output. Parts were assembled by poorly trained laborers, including students and civilians conscripted from every walk of life. Quality control collapsed. Engines left the factory with improperly heat-treated components, while landing gear struts made from low-quality steel with impurities frequently buckled or snapped on landing. The once powerful Homer engine became a symbol of Japan's technological overreach, complex, temperamental, and utterly unreliable in the field. Japanese pilots quickly learned that no two Hayates performed alike. Some could reach speeds close to the advertised maximum, while others barely surpassed 350 miles per hour. Engines often failed after just a few hours of operation. Maintenance crews lacked spare parts, forcing them to cannibalize other aircraft or attempt field repairs with hand-forged replacements. Even minor damage could ground a fighter indefinitely. As Japan's logistics disintegrated, fuel and lubricants of proper specification became nearly impossible to obtain. The result was catastrophic for both performance and morale. Engines ran hot, seized under stress, or simply refused to start. One pilot described it bluntly: the Hayate was a fine airplane when it ran, but too often it did not run. The situation was worsened by Japan's growing fuel crisis. The empire had gone to war in part to secure oil from Southeast Asia, but by 1945, American submarines and bombers had choked off the supply lines completely. High-octane aviation gasoline, vital for performance, became a rarity. While American pilots filled their tanks with 100-octane fuel refined in Texas and California, Japanese flyers made do with fuel that often tested at 87 octane or lower. Some batches fell to 80 octane, producing engine knocking, detonation, and catastrophic pre-ignition. The sophisticated Homer engine, designed for precise tolerances, could not tolerate such fuel. Mechanics resorted to desperate improvisations, mixing in pine root oil, alcohol from sweet potatoes, or even sake byproducts to stretch supplies. The results were predictable: reduced power, fouled plugs, and engines that destroyed themselves mid-flight. As mechanical reliability declined, pilot skill followed. By 1945, Japan's elite corps of aviators had been decimated. Those who had fought over China, the Solomons, and the Philippines were dead or exhausted. Their replacements were rushed through truncated training programs, often receiving fewer than 100 hours of flight instruction, barely enough to master basic takeoffs and landings, let alone complex combat maneuvers. Ammunition shortages limited gunnery practice, and fuel scarcity meant few training flights. In contrast, American pilots arrived in theater with more than 600 hours of experience and hundreds of rounds of live fire training behind them. The imbalance was absolute. Even the Hayate's formidable weapons could not compensate for the inexperience of the men pulling the trigger. Production numbers told the same story of decline. By war's end, Japan had built approximately 3,500 100 Ki-84s, less than half the number of P-51Ds produced. Many of these never flew. Some were destroyed on the ground by American bombing raids, others sat idle, grounded by lack of spare parts, tires, or fuel. Of the aircraft technically listed as operational, perhaps half were actually combat, ready at any given time. The rest languished in hangars, or were cannibalized to keep a few squadrons flying. Pilots went into battle, knowing their planes might fail them at any moment. The Hayate, which should have been Japan's answer to the Mustang, instead became a symbol of a nation's exhaustion. An aircraft that embodied technical brilliance in theory, but logistical futility in practice. In the skies above Japan, these disparities became deadly. Against the smooth, reliable roar of the P-51's Merlin engine, the coughing, sputtering hum was the sound of defeat. Japanese pilots faced their American counterparts not as equals in technology or preparation, but as warriors armed with the remnants of a dying system. The Hayate struggle was the struggle of Japan itself, bold, ingenious, and courageous, but fatally undone by the relentless arithmetic of industrial war. Every Mustang that took off from Iwo Jima represented not just an aircraft, but a nation's capacity to produce excellence at scale. Every Hayate that failed to start its engine on a cold morning in 1945 was a reminder that Japan's war was already lost before it left the ground. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Japan had become a living laboratory for the future of aerial warfare. What unfolded there was not just combat between pilots, but a direct confrontation between two industrial philosophies, one rooted in precision, mass production, and standardization, and the other in handcrafted engineering, resource scarcity, and declining manpower. The American P-51D Mustang had been built for endurance and efficiency. The Japanese Ki-84 Hayate had been conceived for agility and short-range interception. When these two machines met in the thin air above Tokyo and Osaka, the results were tragically predictable. The air battles that raged over Japan's home islands in 1945 were among the most one-sided in aviation history, revealing the full weight of technological and logistical superiority. The first of these confrontations took place on April 7, 1945, when more than 100 Japanese fighters attempted to intercept a formation of B-29 bombers escorted by 91 Mustangs. The Japanese pilots, many of them teenagers with less than 100 hours of flight experience, were shocked to find single-engine American fighters operating deep over the home islands, something their commanders had told them was impossible. Flight Sergeant Totanimizu, flying a Ki-84 that morning, later recalled his disbelief. "We were told that no American fighter could reach Japan. When I saw them with my own eyes, I knew the war was lost." The psychological blow was immediate. For years, Japan's air defense doctrine had been built around the assumption that distance protected the homeland. The sight of P-51s over Tokyo destroyed that illusion in a single day. Major James B. Tapp, commanding one of the lead flights, described the ensuing dogfights in stark, clinical language. "They came at us in the traditional three-lane shot-eye formation, but their coordination was poor," he wrote. The flight leader would attack, but his wingmen hesitated. "We dove through them with 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, fired short bursts and zoom, climbed before they could react. The results were devastating. In minutes, the Mustangs shot down dozens of Japanese aircraft for the loss of only 2 of their own. The Americans returned to Iwo Jima claiming 26 confirmed kills, 1 probable, and 5 damaged, a 13-to-1 kill ratio that would soon become the norm. In subsequent missions, that ratio climbed to 20-to-1, even 30-to-1, as Japanese pilot quality continued to decline. Much of the imbalance stemmed from training. By 1945, American fighter pilots had logged between 400 and 600 flight hours before seeing combat, with extensive instruction in gunnery, formation flying, navigation, and deflection shooting. Japanese replacements, by contrast, were rushed through crash programs that offered as little as 50 hours of total flight time. Many entered combat without ever having fired their guns in practice. Ammunition was too scarce to waste on training. The consequences were catastrophic. In the air, the Americans fought with calm precision, executing tactics developed over years of combat experience. The Japanese, though still courageous, fought with desperation and confusion. Their attacks lacked coordination, their formations broke apart easily, and their inexperienced pilots often fell victim to their own machines, spinning out of control during high-G maneuvers or stalling during climbs. Technological disparity compounded these human differences. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, where most bomber interceptions occurred, the P-51's Merlin engine maintained nearly full power thanks to its two-stage supercharger and efficient intercooling. The Ki-84 single-stage supercharger, lacking such sophistication, caused its engine power to collapse at high altitude. The result was that Japanese fighters, which might have matched the Mustang's speed at lower levels, became helpless above 25,000 feet. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen of the 78th Fighter Squadron described it vividly. We'd see them climbing up to meet us, leaving dark exhaust trails as they firewalled their throttles. By 25,000 feet, they were wallowing like fish out of water. Their engines smoked, probably running too rich because the superchargers couldn't get enough air. We'd dive through their formation with our 50s blazing. The tracers looked like laser beams, and they couldn't match our speed or our climb. The P-51's aerodynamic refinement allowed it to dive at nearly 500 miles per hour while retaining full control authority. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, often suffered control reversal or even structural failure above 400 mph. Many pilots were killed not by enemy fire, but by their own aircraft breaking apart in dives. In the vertical dimension, the modern arena of energy fighting, the Mustang was supreme. Its speed advantage allowed pilots to dictate the terms of engagement, attack from altitude, and disengage at will. Japanese pilots, trained for turning dogfights reminiscent of the early war years, found themselves outclassed by an opponent who refused to play by their rules. The old doctrines of maneuver combat meant nothing against the Mustang's ruthless hit and run tactics. Even nature itself posed deadly challenges. On June 1, 1945, a day the Mustang pilots would remember as Black Friday, whether rather than enemy action became the greatest threat. Around 150 Mustangs en route to Osaka flew into an unexpected front of violent storms, where towering clouds and zero visibility caused chaos. 27 aircraft were lost, 24 of them to weather alone. Pilots became disoriented, collided midair, or ran out of fuel trying to escape the storm. The incident illustrated the razor-thin margins of very long-range VLR operations. Even with the most advanced equipment, the Pacific's weather could kill as surely as flak or fighters. Yet despite such losses, the Americans pressed on, refining navigation procedures and relying on their elaborate rescue network of submarines and Catalina flying boats stationed along the route. The Japanese had no such lifelines. A pilot who bailed out over the sea was as good as dead. By summer, Japan's air resistance had become little more than symbolic. Fuel shortages grounded most fighters. Maintenance crews dismantled damaged planes for spare parts, and young, barely trained pilots were ordered to fly kamikaze missions in obsolete aircraft. Those who still took to the skies did so with fatalistic acceptance. In contrast, the Mustang pilots of Iwo Jima flew their missions with mechanical reliability, logistical abundance, and the confidence that came from knowing they were part of an unstoppable machine. Each sortie consumed 60,000 gallons of high-octane fuel, fired hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition, and drew on a supply chain stretching from California to the volcanic dust of the Pacific. Japan, by comparison, was scavenging pine roots to distill a few gallons of crude aviation fuel. In the cold arithmetic of air warfare, courage and tradition could no longer compete with science and supply. The dogfights above Tokyo and Nagoya were not merely tactical encounters. They were the death throes of an old world, one in which skill and spirit had once reigned supreme. The P-51 Mustang, with its disciplined pilots and flawless engineering, represented a new kind of power, impersonal, industrial, and inexorable. Each clash in the clear blue air over Japan made the outcome of the war increasingly inevitable. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Hayate. It buried an entire philosophy of warfare beneath the contrails that stretched from Mount Fuji to the endless Pacific horizon. By the closing months of 1945, Japan's air defense system had ceased to function as an organized force. The once proud Sentai fighter units that had swept across Asia were now shattered remnants, flying what few aircraft remained airworthy and crewed by exhausted, undertrained pilots. The skies over the home islands, once the sanctuary of the empire, had become a domain of American dominance. The P-51D Mustang, operating from the captured airstrips of Iwo Jima, was now the undisputed master of Japanese airspace. Its presence over Tokyo was both practical and psychological, a silver herald of defeat that proved Japan's homeland was no longer beyond reach. What began as a technical marvel had become a symbol of inevitability, a manifestation of industrial superiority so overwhelming that resistance itself seemed futile. By mid-summer, the statistics spoke volumes. Between April and August 1945, the Mustangs of Iwo Jima were credited with over 200 confirmed aerial victories, accounting for 3/4 of all P-51 kills in the Pacific Theater. Yet these figures, impressive as they were, only hinted at the broader impact. The Mustang's ability to escort B-29 bombers deep into Japan changed the strategic calculus of the war. American bombers, once forced to fly at night to avoid heavy losses, could now strike in daylight with devastating precision. The great industrial cities of Japan, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya became infernos of destruction, their infrastructure obliterated in wave after wave of firebombing raids. Factories, rail yards, and shipyards were reduced to smoking ruins, and the nation's industrial output collapsed. For Japan, the psychological effects were even more profound. Civilians and soldiers alike watched American fighters strafe trains, trucks, and airfields in broad daylight, unopposed. The myth of the kamikaze and the divine wind that would protect the homeland disintegrated under the glare of sunlight reflecting from P-51 wings. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, a Ki-84 pilot with the 47th Sentai, captured the despair in his diary. "We were told the B-29s were vulnerable without escort. Now the Mustangs fly over the palace itself, shooting down our best pilots as if they were beginners. How can we defend the Emperor when enemies' fighters roam freely over the sacred homeland?" His words revealed the psychological breaking point of a generation raised to believe in Japan's invincibility. The appearance of the P-51 over Tokyo was more than a military event. It was the death knell of an empire's illusion. Even for the victorious Americans, the missions pushed the limits of human endurance. The VLR very long-range sorties often lasted 8 hours or more, with pilots confined to their cockpits, unable to stand or move. They endured leg cramps, numbness, dehydration, and the ever-present terror of engine failure over an endless ocean. Relief tubes froze at altitude, oxygen masks chafed their faces raw, and the hypnotic monotony of the Pacific horizon tested their sanity. Major James B. Tapp, reflecting years later, described it succinctly. "Fighting the Japanese wasn't the hardest part. Getting from point A to point B was. Each mission was a test of stamina and discipline as much as skill, a human mirror of the mechanical precision that defined the P-51 itself." Behind every flight stood a logistical network unparalleled in human history. Thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowed daily from the continental United States to Pacific bases via fleets of Liberty ships and C-54 transports. Entire supply chains existed solely to keep the Mustangs flying. Maintenance crews at Iwo Jima worked around the clock in the island's volcanic dust, replacing engines, patching bullet holes, and overhauling aircraft in open air. Despite harsh conditions, the Mustangs maintained operational readiness rates exceeding 80%, numbers that astonished even their designers. Japanese fighters, in contrast, rarely achieved 40% serviceability. Some squadrons had more grounded aircraft than operational ones. As Japan's industrial base collapsed, so too did its ability to sustain warfare. Aircraft were cannibalized for spare parts, fuel was hoarded for kamikaze missions, and pilots were sent to die in machines that often failed before reaching altitude. By August, organized Japanese air resistance had effectively vanished. The final air battles over Japan were brief and tragic. On August 10, 1945, the Mustangs of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups engaged the last remnants of Japan's air force near Tokyo, claiming 7 victories. 5 days later, on August 15, the day Japan officially surrendered, Lieutenant Jerry Yellen and his wingman, 19-year-old Second Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg, took off from Iwo Jima on what would become the final combat mission of the war. They attacked airfields near Nagoya, unaware that the Emperor had already recorded his surrender broadcast. Schlamberg was shot down by ground fire and became the last American killed in combat during World War II. The war had already ended in principle, yet in those final moments the guns still spoke, proof that even in defeat, Japan's defenders clung to their duty until the very last heartbeat. The aftermath of these missions left Japan's skies eerily silent. The B-29s that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew without escort, not because protection was unavailable, but because none was necessary. There were simply no Japanese fighters left to oppose them. The air war had been won so completely that American planners could operate without concern for enemy interference. It was victory measured not in individual heroism, but in the cold arithmetic of industry, logistics, and technology. Out of 514 Ki-84 Hayates built, only one survives today, displayed at the Kairan Peace Museum in Kagoshima, a solitary relic of a vanished era. By contrast, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs still fly, their Merlin engines still singing over airfields in America and Europe, living testaments to the machine that redefined air power. The contrast between these outcomes encapsulates the deeper lesson of the Pacific Air War. The P-51 Mustang was not merely faster or better armed, it was the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, one in which industrial capacity and technological sophistication determined destiny. It proved that courage, though noble, could not compensate for the lack of fuel, parts, and training. Japan's warrior ethos, forged in centuries of tradition, met the modern world's unforgiving mathematics and was found wanting. In the end, the Mustang's silver silhouette over Mount Fuji was more than a symbol of military victory. It was the visible manifestation of a new age, one where the production line, the supercharger, and the assembly plant had replaced the sword and the code of the samurai. As the war faded into memory, the P-51 endured as a legend not only for its beauty and performance, but for what it represented. It was the machine that made distance irrelevant, that carried the fight to the enemy's doorstep, and that demonstrated the ultimate truth of modern conflict. In an industrial war, the side that can build, fuel, and sustain its machines will always prevail. The Japanese pilots who looked up and saw those gleaming Mustangs over their capital were witnessing more than an aircraft. They were seeing the end of an era. The divine wind had failed, and in its place came the relentless hum of the Merlin engine, echoing the triumph of technology over tradition and the dawn of a new world forged in the smoke and steel of the skies above Tokyo.